The golden morning light streamed through the towering trees of Central Park, bathing the scene in a serene glow. Joggers passed by with rhythmic steps, dog walkers strolled leisurely, and birdwatchers like Ethan Daniels stood silently, binoculars poised, watching the delicate flurry of wings as a sparrow darted through the air. Ethan loved these moments. This was his escape. Just him, the birds, and the crisp morning air. Today, he had spotted a rare warbler, its vibrant yellow feathers glowing against the green canopy. Suddenly, a flurry of barking and scuffling interrupted the peace. A golden retriever burst through the underbrush, scattering the birds and leaving silence in its wake. Ethan lowered his binoculars and turned toward the source. A woman, tall and impeccably dressed in athleisure, strolled lazily behind the dog, ignoring the chaos it had caused. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ethan called out, keeping his voice polite but firm. "The park requires dogs to be on a leash in this area. It's for the safety of the birds and everyone else." Lauren Whitman turned to face him, her expression one of mild irritation that quickly morphed into disdain. "Excuse me," she said, as if offended by his very existence. Ethan pointed to the clearly visible sign a few feet away. "There's a rule about leashing dogs here." Lauren scoffed. "Well, it's not bothering anyone." She gestured dismissively toward the now panting golden retriever. "He's just having fun." Ethan inhaled deeply, keeping his composure. "I understand, but the rules are there for a reason. It's about respecting everyone's space." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Who do you think you are, telling me what to do?" Ethan took a step back, willing himself to remain calm. His mind raced with a mix of frustration and dread, emotions he had trained himself to suppress in moments like this. He had encountered people like Lauren before, entitled, deflective, and quick to escalate any situation where they felt their authority or comfort was challenged. He knew how dangerous these interactions could become, how they could spiral out of control with a single word or gesture being misinterpreted. Ethan reminded himself to keep his tone measured and his movements deliberate. This wasn't the first time he had been in a situation where his presence alone seemed to trigger someone's fear or hostility. He had spent years perfecting the art of staying composed, aware of the scrutiny that came with his skin color. Yet, no amount of preparation could fully insulate him from the frustration and helplessness that situations like this evoked. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm simply asking that you leash your dog, as the park requires. It's a safety issue, for the birds, for other park-goers, and even for your dog." Lauren's eyes narrowed, her indignation growing. She took a deliberate step closer, closing some of the distance Ethan had created. "You're being aggressive right now. You're making me feel unsafe," she said, her tone laced with accusation. Her words cut through the air like a warning, sharp and calculated. Ethan blinked, momentarily taken aback. He felt a flicker of disbelief, quickly replaced by a cold, creeping realization. "Aggressive?" he asked, his voice even. "I'm standing several feet away from you, speaking calmly and respectfully. How exactly is that aggressive?" Lauren ignored his words, her gaze sharpening as she reached into her pocket. Ethan watched as she pulled out her phone, the faint smirk on her lips betraying her intentions. She held it up, angling it toward him. Her voice shifted dramatically, adopting a trembling, fearful tone that rang with artificial distress. "This man is threatening me and my dog," she said loudly, her voice carrying over the stillness of the park. She emphasized the words man and threatening, her eyes darting between Ethan and her phone screen as if to capture his every move. "I don't know what he's planning, but I feel very unsafe." Ethan's chest tightened, his stomach twisting into knots. He felt the weight of her words, their dangerous implications hanging heavily in the air. He knew exactly where this was heading, and the realization chilled him to the core. He had seen stories like this play out too many times, where false accusations had escalated into tragic outcomes. Taking a steadying breath, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. His hand was steady, but inside, he was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, disbelief, fear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "I'm recording this for my safety. All I've done is ask you to leash your dog, as the park rules require. Lauren barely acknowledged his words, her performance continuing unabated. She turned away slightly, speaking into her phone. 911? Yes, I need help, she said, her voice trembling with faux panic. There's a black man threatening me in Central Park. He's being very aggressive and I don't feel safe. Ethan stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. The ease with which she spun her narrative, the utter confidence with which she weaponized her privilege, left him momentarily speechless. His mind raced as he recorded every word, knowing that this video might be the only thing standing between him and potential disaster. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, his voice tinged with incredulity. Lauren glanced back at him briefly, her eyes flashing with a mix of defiance and satisfaction. It was a look he recognized all too well, a look that said, "I have the upper hand, and there's nothing you can do about it." Turning back to her phone, she continued her fabricated story with renewed vigor. "He's standing right here, glaring at me," she said into the receiver. "I think he's going to attack me. Please send someone quickly." The weight of her words pressed down on Ethan like a suffocating blanket. Every syllable dripped with malice, each one carefully crafted to paint him as a threat. He kept his phone trained on her, his mind racing through possible outcomes. He thought of his family, his career, and the countless others who had been in similar situations but hadn't had the foresight or the opportunity to record their side of the story. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but firm, "everything you're saying is a lie, and I have it all on video. You should think very carefully about what you're doing." Lauren didn't respond, her focus entirely on the call. Ethan could hear the faint murmur of the dispatcher on the other end of the line, and his heart sank. He knew the police would be here soon, and he braced himself for what would follow. In that moment, standing in the middle of the park, surrounded by towering trees and the chirping of distant birds, Ethan felt the crushing weight of a system designed to believe people like Lauren over people like him. But he also felt a spark of determination. He wasn't going to let her falsehoods define this encounter. He wasn't going to let her narrative erase the truth. He held his phone steady, recording every second, knowing that this evidence was his shield, his sword, and his voice in a world that so often tried to silence people like him. Minutes later, the wail of sirens echoed through the park, causing heads to turn. Two police officers, both appearing tense, exited their patrol car and began approaching the scene. Their footsteps were heavy on the gravel path as they scanned the area, their eyes locking onto the two figures, Lauren, gesturing frantically, and Ethan, standing composed yet visibly guarded. Before they could say a word, Lauren rushed toward them, her dog's leash trailing behind her. She pointed an accusatory finger at Ethan, her voice shrill and cracking with faux distress. "He threatened me," she exclaimed, loud enough for nearby parkgoers to stop and watch. "I was just walking my dog, minding my own business, and he came out of nowhere, yelling at me and being aggressive. I felt so unsafe." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions serious as they turned toward Ethan. One of them, a tall man with a sharp jawline and a badge that read Officer Price, stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his belt. His partner, a slightly shorter woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood close by, observing the situation carefully. "Sir," Officer Price said, his tone clipped but professional, "we need to hear your side of the story." Ethan, anticipating this moment, took a deep breath and nodded. "Of course, officer," he replied, his voice calm but firm. He reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid alarming them, and pulled out his phone. "But before I say anything, I'd like you to see this." The officers hesitated for a moment, their eyes narrowing slightly as they watched Ethan tap his phone to play the video. The recording captured everything. The calm way Ethan had asked Lauren to leash her dog, her dismissive responses, the escalation of her accusations, and, most damningly, the fabricated 911 call. Officer Price and his partner, Officer Ramirez, leaned in to watch. As the seconds ticked by, their initial skepticism gave way to discomfort, then a subtle but unmistakable shift in their demeanor. Officer Price's jaw tightened, while Officer Ramirez's eyes flicked toward Lauren, her expression hardening. When the video ended, Officer Price exhaled sharply and handed the phone back to Ethan. He turned to Lauren, his voice now tinged with frustration. "Ma'am," he said sternly, "the video doesn't corroborate your statement. Can you explain why your version of events doesn't match what we just saw?" Lauren's face went pale, her confidence draining in an instant. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stumbled out incoherently. I felt threatened," she stammered, her voice trembling. "He was looming over me. I didn't know what he was going to do." Officer Ramirez raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. "Ma'am, based on what we've seen, it looks like Mr. Daniels was standing at a reasonable distance and speaking calmly. There's no indication of any aggression or threat." Lauren's eyes darted around the scene, searching for support, but the growing crowd of onlookers only deepened her discomfort. A few people murmured among themselves, and someone in the distance held up their phone, likely recording the interaction. Ethan, still holding his phone, finally spoke up. "Officers, I'm a state lawyer. I know my rights, and I also know the weight of filing a false police report," he said evenly, his gaze steady. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. This is a blatant attempt to weaponize the system against me." The tension in the air was palpable as the officers processed his words. Officer Price hesitated, glancing toward his partner, who gave a small nod. "Ma'am," Officer Price said, his tone firm but measured, "I'm going to have to document this incident. Your claims are serious, and filing a false police report is a criminal offense. I suggest you consider the consequences of your actions." Lauren's indignation flared briefly, but it quickly crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the officer's scrutiny. I didn't mean," she began, her voice trailing off. Officer Ramirez interjected, her tone curt. "Ma'am, we'll need you to leash your dog immediately. And moving forward, I suggest you adhere to park rules and avoid making baseless accusations." Lauren's hands shook as she fumbled with the leash, her previous confidence replaced by humiliation. Her dog wagged its tail innocently, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. The officers turned back to Ethan. "Mr. Daniels," Officer Price said, his voice softer now, "you're free to go. Thank you for cooperating and providing the evidence." Ethan gave a small nod. "Thank you, officers. I hope this serves as a reminder of how these situations can escalate unnecessarily." As the officers walked back toward their car, Ethan stood in the park, phone still in hand. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people approached him, offering words of support or simply nodding in solidarity. He felt a mix of relief and residual anger. Relief that the evidence had protected him this time, and anger at how easily the situation could have gone differently without it. Lauren remained standing a few feet away, her face red with embarrassment as she hurriedly clipped the leash onto her dog and walked away, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Ethan watched her retreating figure, his mind already turning to what he would do next. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. By the time Ethan stepped through the front door of his modest apartment, the weight of the day began to settle over him. He set his keys on the counter and leaned against the kitchen island, exhaling deeply. He glanced at his phone, which had been buzzing incessantly during his drive home. The notifications were so frequent that his lock screen looked like a ticker tape of social media updates, texts, and missed calls. Curious and somewhat wary, Ethan unlocked his phone. What he saw left him momentarily stunned. His video had exploded across social media platforms. It had started with a few shares from friends and colleagues who were appalled by the footage, but it quickly gained momentum, spreading like wildfire. Prominent figures in the fight against racial injustice had picked it up, amplifying its reach. The hashtags were everywhere. Hashtag Central Park Karen, hashtag Justice for Ethan, and hashtag Racial Bias Exposed. Posts poured in, many expressing outrage over Lauren's actions. People dissected every second of the video, commenting on her entitled demeanor, her false accusations, and the chilling implications of her behavior. Others commended Ethan's composure, highlighting how calmly and intelligently he had handled the situation. Ethan scrolled through the comments, a mix of anger, support, and reflection. This is why we need to hold people accountable for false accusations. This could have ended tragically if Ethan didn't have proof. Another example of weaponized privilege. When will this stop? Ethan handled this with so much grace. A lesser person might have snapped, and the consequences could have been deadly. Thank you, Ethan, for sharing this. We stand with you. His phone buzzed again. This time, a call from a number he didn't recognize. Ignoring it, Ethan moved to the next notification. A direct message from a well-known journalist requesting an interview. Before he could respond, another message popped up from a civil rights organization asking if they could share his story on their platform. Ethan rubbed his temples, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attention. He had posted the video not to seek fame or notoriety, but to protect himself and highlight a systemic issue. Now, it had taken on a life of its own. He switched to Twitter, where his mentions were a blur of activity. Activists, lawyers, and celebrities were commenting, sharing the video with their own reflections on the broader implications. Several posts compared Ethan's incident to other recent cases where false accusations against Black individuals had escalated into dangerous or even deadly encounters. One particularly poignant post caught his attention. Ethan Daniels' story is a reminder that without video evidence, he could have been another statistic. We need systemic change to prevent this from happening again. Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was his younger sister, Mia, calling. He picked up, her concerned voice cutting through the din of his thoughts. Ethan, I just saw the video. Are you okay? She asked, her voice a mix of worry and anger. I'm fine, Mia, he replied, trying to reassure her. It was tense, but I kept my cool. The video seems to have done its job. That woman, she's despicable, Mia exclaimed. How dare she put you in that position? And the way she played the victim. It's disgusting. Ethan sighed. It's not just about her, Mia. She's a symptom of a much bigger problem. That's what I want people to focus on. Well, it's working, Mia said. People are talking. This could be a turning point, Ethan. You've already inspired so many. As he ended the call, Ethan felt a mix of emotions. The support pouring in was overwhelming, but it also came with the weight of responsibility. People were looking to him to speak out, to represent a movement that went beyond his personal experience. The next notification was from a national news outlet requesting a live interview. Ethan hesitated. While he was used to public speaking in courtrooms, this was different. This wasn't just about the law, it was personal. But he also knew the importance of using this moment to amplify the message. He replied with a cautious yes, setting up an interview for the following day. As he sat down on his couch, the enormity of the situation began to sink in. What had started as a quiet morning of birdwatching had turned into a national incident. Ethan knew his life wouldn't be the same after this. Looking out the window at the city lights, Ethan resolved to channel the attention into something meaningful. This wasn't just his fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged or falsely accused because of the color of their skin. And now, he had the platform to make a difference. Then Daniels had always been a firm believer in accountability. The law was his weapon of choice, one he wielded to protect the innocent and challenge injustices. When it became clear that Lauren Whitman's actions had not only endangered him but represented a broader, systemic issue, Ethan knew he had to act. Filing a civil lawsuit against her for defamation and filing a false police report wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about setting a precedent. The lawsuit quickly captured public attention. Legal analysts debated its implications on news channels, with some lauding Ethan's courage while others questioned whether this case would truly make a difference in dismantling systemic racial biases. Social media buzzed with anticipation as updates about the case spread like wildfire. The hashtags #JusticeForEthan and #HoldHerAccountable became rallying cries for activists and allies alike. Lauren, under mounting pressure and scrutiny, hired a high-profile attorney, Christopher Marlowe, known for his ruthless courtroom tactics. Marlowe's strategy was clear: to paint Lauren as a victim of misunderstanding and overreaction, a woman overwhelmed by fear in a tense situation. Her defense hinged on portraying her actions as instinctive, not malicious, a difficult argument to sustain given the damning video evidence. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, with journalists, activists, and members of the public filling every available seat. Ethan sat at his table, flanked by his legal team, his posture composed and confident. Lauren, on the other hand, appeared tense, her eyes darting nervously as cameras clicked and whispered conversations swirled around her. The trial began with opening statements. Ethan's lawyer, an eloquent and seasoned civil rights attorney named Janine Carter, addressed the jury with precision. "This case isn't just about Mr. Daniels," Janine said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It's about the dangerous consequences of false accusations. It's about a system where privilege can be weaponized against the innocent, and how this behavior perpetuates injustice." Marlowe's opening statement took a different tone. "This is a case of miscommunication," he said, gesturing toward Lauren. "My client, Lauren Whitman, was simply a woman trying to protect herself in what she perceived to be a threatening situation. Fear is not a crime, ladies and gentlemen." The tension in the room was palpable as both sides prepared to present their evidence. Janine began by playing the video Ethan had recorded, letting the courtroom witness the calm and composed way he had handled the situation versus Lauren's exaggerated performance. The video was damning. Gasps echoed through the room as Lauren's 911 call played, juxtaposed with Ethan's calm request for her to leash her dog. The prosecution then brought in witnesses who had been in the park that day. A jogger testified, "I was running past them when I saw the man, Mr. Daniels, speaking to her politely. There was nothing threatening about his behavior. But she started yelling, and I couldn't understand why." Another witness, a fellow dog walker, said, "I've seen Lauren in the park before. She often lets her dog off the leash despite the rules. I wasn't surprised she caused a scene, but the way she escalated it was shocking." Marlowe tried to undermine the witnesses, suggesting they were biased or didn't have a clear view of the interaction. But his efforts faltered in the face of their consistent accounts. Janine called upon experts in racial bias to contextualize Lauren's actions. Dr. Emily Harris, a sociologist specializing in systemic racism, took the stand. "False accusations like this are not isolated incidents," Dr. Harris explained. "They are part of a broader pattern where people of color, particularly black men, are viewed as inherently threatening. These biases, whether conscious or unconscious, can have devastating consequences." Her testimony resonated deeply, not just with the jury but with the audience following the case online. Clips of her statements went viral, sparking renewed conversations about privilege and accountability. Marlowe countered by calling a psychologist who attempted to argue that Lauren's reaction was a fight-or-flight response triggered by genuine fear. However, under cross-examination, Janine dismantled this argument by pointing out the calculated nature of Lauren's behavior, such as her decision to fabricate details on the 911 call. The turning point came when Lauren herself took the stand. Marlowe coached her to appear remorseful but firm in her assertion that she had felt threatened. "I didn't mean to harm anyone," she said, her voice quivering. I was scared. I thought he was going to hurt me." Janine approached her calmly during cross-examination, her gaze steady. "Ms. Whitman, you stated that you were scared. Yet, in the video, Mr. Daniels is standing several feet away, speaking calmly. Can you explain how that constitutes a threat?" Lauren hesitated, fumbling for words. I don't know. It was just his presence. His presence," Janine repeated, her tone sharp. "So you're saying that simply being a black man in your vicinity was enough to make you feel threatened?" Lauren's face turned red. "That's not what I meant. But that's exactly what you conveyed," Janine pressed. "Not just to the police, but to the world, when you called 911 and accused Mr. Daniels of threatening you. Your words weren't just wrong. They were dangerous." Lauren's composure cracked. The jury watched as her facade of confidence crumbled under the weight of Janine's questioning. By the end of her testimony, it was clear that her defense was in tatters. The trial extended beyond the courtroom. News outlets dissected every moment, and public opinion swayed overwhelmingly in Ethan's favor. Legal scholars debated the case's significance, with some calling it a watershed moment in holding individuals accountable for racially biased behavior. Activists used the momentum to push for legislative changes, including harsher penalties for filing false police reports. Ethan himself became a reluctant public figure, speaking at rallies and participating in panel discussions about systemic racism. "This case isn't just about me," Ethan said during an interview. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did. It's about creating a society where accountability isn't optional." The courtroom victory was only the beginning. News of Ethan's legal triumph against Lauren Whitman reverberated across the nation, sparking protests and renewed conversations about racial justice. Activists took to the streets in major cities, holding signs that read "Accountability Now," "False Accusations Kill," and "Justice for Ethan." Social media campaigns gained even more traction, with influencers, community leaders, and everyday citizens demanding legislative reform to address the weaponization of race in law enforcement interactions. At a rally in New York City's Times Square, Ethan stood before a sea of supporters. The crowd cheered as he approached the microphone, but his expression was one of measured determination. He raised his hand to quiet the applause, his voice strong as he began to speak. "This isn't just about me," he said, his words echoing through the square. "This is about the systemic issues that allow these incidents to happen over and over again. I was lucky. I had evidence. But how many others don't? How many voices have gone unheard because the system wasn't built to protect them?" The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan pressed on. "We need to hold people accountable. Filing a false police report isn't just a lie. It's an act of violence. It's a weapon that can ruin lives, or worse. Together, we can create a society where everyone feels safe, where privilege can no longer be used as a shield for injustice." Ethan's words resonated deeply, galvanizing attendees. Community leaders approached him afterward, eager to collaborate on initiatives. Within weeks, Ethan was helping draft policy recommendations for stricter penalties against false police reports and advocating for mandatory racial bias training in law enforcement and emergency dispatch centers. As the movement gained momentum, Ethan found himself thrust into the spotlight as a reluctant leader. He juggled his career as a lawyer with his newfound role as an activist, appearing on talk shows, writing op-eds, and consulting with lawmakers. His message was clear. Systemic change was possible, but only if people were willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about privilege and prejudice. The courtroom was packed on the final day of the trial. Tension hung heavy in the air as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Ethan sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, while Lauren fidgeted nervously at the defendant's table, her lawyer whispering last-minute reassurances. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Ethan Daniels." A wave of relief washed over Ethan as the room erupted in murmurs. The judge continued, outlining the penalties. Lauren was ordered to pay $100,000 in damages to Ethan, a sum that would go toward compensating him for emotional distress and legal costs. Additionally, she was sentenced to 200 hours of community service with racial equity organizations, a punishment designed to educate and rehabilitate, not just penalize. "Ms. Whitman," the judge said sternly, "your actions were not only harmful to Mr. Daniels but emblematic of a larger problem in our society. This court hopes that through this ruling, you will come to understand the consequences of your behavior and contribute meaningfully to addressing the harm you've caused." Ethan thanked his legal team and left the courthouse to a crowd of supporters and journalists. While the verdict felt like justice, Ethan knew it was just one battle in a much larger war.